What do you think of when you hear the words science fiction? Starship captains and photon cannons, cyborgs and fully simulated worlds? Maybe an endless stream of C-tier movies spring to mind, like a corny CG monster lurking in the shadows. Yet, for a genre which so regularly depicts the unimaginably distant, there's something captivatingly familiar to be found within the broad scope of stories which fall under the umbrella of science fiction. They are tales which hold humanity up to a mirror, asking tough questions and revealing inescapable truths about our very being. Our greed and our love, power and vulnerability, changeability and rigidity, and of course, our innate curiosity, are all placed under the spotlight and put to the test. More often than not, modern sci-fi stories revolved around a common central theme. To play with the unknown, or the powers of godhood, is akin to playing with fire. Whether sitting directly in the penumbra of this idea, or viewing it from a distance, like a dimming sun, it is ever present. In fact, it is key to the genre as a whole. Take, for example, Star Trek, some unquestionably pure sci-fi, in which humanity's evolution and contact with a wider universe has introduced a new era of thought and technological achievement, introducing an age wherein our species tries to defy our nature and ascend as a force of greater benevolence. Even then, the majority of Star Trek plots involve humans struggling to remain within the constraints of their own self-appointed moral code, like a creepy chain restaurant manager. For all the Federation's posing and posturing, they'll throw aside the Prime Directive like last week's leftovers the moment Grandma has a phaser pointed to her head. Screw those fish people, they're threatening Mimi, and I have a ship with the big guns. To err is to be human, after all. Yet that is exactly the point the genre is trying to make. As our mastery over the universe continues to expand, so too does the potential for our darker nature to corrupt this newfound power. In my personal opinion, few examples of science fiction drive this point home with as much impact as Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and the Cyberpunk setting. Now, you may very well have already drawn a straight line between the two thinking, duh, they're similar. Frankenstein is made up of all sorts of different body parts, and Cyberpunk is defined by replacing your limbs and organs with a sick-ass chrome. Like, everybody in Cyberpunk is being their own personal Dr. Frankenstein just all the time on themselves, so what's your point? To which I would reply, glad you're already making comparisons. Now let's take it to the next level, because I think I can show you how these similarities are more than just stitched skin deep. So then, I invite you to join me as we explore how a 200-year-old horror novel eventually brought about a vibrant subgenre of corpos and chrome. Perhaps the most interesting character brought to the public mind by the publication of Frankenstein is the author herself, Mary Shelley. In her pre-Victorian era youth, Shelley was exposed to some of the most brilliant writers and artists of her time, as well as her fair share of tragedy and hardship. Her mother died days after her birth, and her relationships with her father, sister, and lover were strained, at times, to say the least. In fact, the creation of her most prolific publications reportedly took place during some of the darkest periods in her life. Perhaps literally, as a massive Indonesian volcano eruption was documented to have dimmed the skies of Europe for an extended period prior to her having written the book. Beyond this, Shelley traveled across many countries, witnessing the impact of the Industrial Revolution firsthand as a new century of widespread technological achievement began to unfold before her very eyes. Undoubtedly, these experiences shaped her into the keen and unique mind which was capable of producing such works as Frankenstein. But would it surprise you to know that she published the book at only 18 years old? Widely regarded as a literary masterpiece, Shelley's horrific tale of a young doctor's tragic experiments over the power of life itself has captured the imagination of spooky-feeling lovers of all sorts for over 2 centuries now, having been published all the way back in 1818. This means it well predates the science-inspired stories belonging to H.G. Wells or the twisted horror stories of Lovecraft. And while some earlier authors had produced fiction involving significant scientific elements, some would argue that Frankenstein itself marks the very beginnings of the modern sci-fi genre as we know it today. Writer Brian Aldiss noted that it was the first narrative which turns to modern experiments in the laboratory in order to achieve its fiction, all without relying on overtly fantastical plot elements. Certainly, interpretations of alien species and spacecraft and androids had come about before this time, but this was something new. something which relied on an innate knowledge of the natural world and humankind's power over its limitations. It wasn't only about discovery, it was about our power of discovery. Sure, there are creatures on the moon, but take what you know about anatomy and physiology, throw in some electrodes and morbid curiosity, and you've got a whole new beast on your hands. Knowing this, and the era in which the book was first published, it only lends credence to the incredible talent and inspiration Shelley possessed in order to create this caliber of story at such a young age, no less. She essentially invented a genre. No easy feat by any measure. So, as a brief synopsis, the story of Frankenstein follows the titular brilliant doctor as he recounts the tale of his fateful experiment, which resulted in the creation of a hulking being referred to as the Creature, or quite popularly these days, Frankenstein's monster. The creature was composed of body parts gathered from exhumed corpses, an ignoble effort for a noble cause, the pursuit of creating the perfect man. While the creature was made to be beautiful, the process proves flawed, and ultimately they are born with a hideous and frightening visage instead. Over time, the creature loses a childlike innocence, and due to mistreatment from the humans he comes across in his early life, he grows to become cruel, vengeful, and even murderous. The creature, rightfully, blames Dr. Frankenstein for his very existence, and believes that due to his living state, he is owed a chance at happiness in spite of others' fearful reactions towards him. A terrible feud smolders between the creator and the created, as they hunt and haunt one another, eventually resulting in the supposed destruction of both their lives amidst the frigid expanse of the North Pole. It is a tragic and cautionary tale, possessing layers of theme regarding romance, man's place in nature, and perhaps most importantly, the threat of unhindered technology. Cyberpunk is a subgenre of science fiction all on its own. Its roots lie in the weird and wild literature of the 60s, when people began to think that the future might be more scary than peaceful, and also that drugs are super cool and they'll almost certainly continue to be so for a long, long time. For a moment, there was an almost comical optimism regarding the future following World War II. Automation, new forms of energy, concepts of ease and convenience never before known. We had godlike power, and damn it, we wanted that cat out of the bag. People saw automobiles and computers and automatic weapons, and they thought, this looks like a good way to make a buck. Nothing bad has ever happened due to that mindset, right? As a quick aside, this is happening right now concerning AI. You, a stranger, can't even trust that the voice in this video is a real person, because you can't see my throat cords pushing air towards your ear holes at a personal level this very moment. We are always caught between the massive, spiked, rolling wheel of advancement and our own tangible lives. And baby, that wheel is going to keep on rolling as long as it's greased with dollar bills. Well, that's right where the core of Cyberpunk sits. In an alley aglow with brilliant neon, soaked in the yellowish acid rain steadily falling from a smog-strewn sky. An acid rain being the byproduct of some megacorp's environmental carelessness, and this carelessness being the result of some unseen suits and their bottomless greed. It's a world where humanity's worth is in constant question, both on a physical and metaphysical level. Cyber limbs aren't just better than what you're born with, they're cheaper too. And a person's attention, their time, their very brain, those are all just opportunities, ad spots waiting to be filled with a value that can be calculated, and on average, the result is going to be shockingly low. Life is expendable, death is cheap. That is the reality for the average person living in a cyberpunk world. The works of John Wagner's Judge Dredd, first seen in 1977, or William Gibson's Neuromancer, released in 1984, helped to establish the subgenre's primary features. It's sort of all in the name, right? You've got the unfortunates, the outcasts, living on the edge of established society, the punks, as it were. In addition, you have a world dominated by its relationship with technology, to the point where one's own body and mind are irreversibly intertwined with its influence. The cyber. Mix those two things together, and you're cooking with chew too. Cyberpunk stories often like to ask us what the boundaries of humanity really are, and how far we're willing to push them for our own devices. It forces us to look at our reliance on technology and say, is this really worth the cost? While simultaneously telling you, as if there's anything you can do to stop it anyway, buddy. Another prevalent feature of the setting, famously adapted by the Cyberpunk 2020 tabletop RPG, developed by Mike Pondsmith, and its video game adaptation in Cyberpunk 2077, is the influence of the Megacorp. These towering conglomerates don't just pull the strings, they are the strings. Actually, they're the whole damn puppet, too. Sometimes they misstep. Sometimes they get blown up. But they're never removed from the equation. Not entirely. Because they are a greater, more nebulous force than any given singular human. They are society. Just a society which looks at its citizens as dollar signs, not people. So yeah, it's a world set in its system. But that system isn't without its outliers, and boy are they pissed. They might not make a dent. They might not change things in the long run, but they are going to howl into that void for all to hear before going out with a bang. And that's all there is to it, so far as they're concerned. That sounds pretty cyberpunk to me. So where and how does such a relatively modern subgenre and a 200-year-old classic horror novel begin to intersect? Well, for starters, they both heavily involve that same theme discussed earlier, playing God. Dr. Frankenstein does so in a directly comparable means, proclaiming his special technique to create life, like some manner of divine teenage meltdown. As blasphemous as it is badass, this very first transgression against the natural order of the universe works to establish the rules of science fiction, seemingly for all time to come. With such experimentation comes a terrible danger. A danger which can exact a terrible cost. Take, for example, the game Cyberpunk 2077 and its accompanying anime, Cyberpunk Edgerunners, with its focus on the fictional condition, cyberpsychosis. Cyberpsychosis is the result of pushing the human body and spirit beyond its limitations due to an overindulgence in cyberware. This ailment causes a loss of the self and a fixation on hyperviolence which cannot be reverted. It is the unleashing of the darker persona, with all the power of a wrist-mounted rocket launcher at its disposal. This sickness embodies science fiction's classic cautionary tale, a repackaged Icarus's punishment for flying too close to the sun of godhood. However, cyberpsychosis is not the creature, in Frankenstein terms, not really anyway. It is a symptom of the true Frankenstein's monster, which has been released on this world en masse, cyberware itself. The corpos are the Doctor, unhindered by future calamity. The work in the lab has already been done in Cyberpunk, and they've already screamed, "It's alive!" 1,000 times over, and their monster is already on an utter, unhindered rampage. This complete disregard of the lessons learned in Frankenstein is actually sort of definitive of the cyberpunk setting. Canonically, the study of cyberpsychosis and its roots are dissuaded. Violent incidents are covered up, all because they may threaten the bottom line. There's a status quo to maintain, after all. Contributors to the problem willingly turn a blind eye to the dangers of their own technology, despite birthing new creatures all the time. These matters are only a series of hiccups on the path toward greatness, nothing more. There's also something to be said concerning the concept of cyberpsychosis and how it devolves its sufferers into a base state of violent behavior, stripping them of their humanity, as it were. And the creature comes to suffer a similar fate. The breaking point of cyberpsychosis is the moment the lightning hits the corpse, reanimating a being as something new and different, motivated by the simplest of drives. In Mary Shelley's novel, the creature grows to become quite articulate. It first parleys with its creator. He informs the Doctor that he desires a companion, a wife, so that he might not be alone. Frankenstein nearly fulfills this request, but in one of the story's most astounding and influential twists, he destroys the creature's would-be wife, realizing that their union could mean the birth of humanity's rival, and perhaps even their future destroyer. Sound at all familiar? In the cyberpunk setting, humanity's rival has not only been birthed, they've been mass-produced. Everybody wants to board out here. The scientists in these worlds accepted the threats and hurdles of transcending humanity without hardly blinking an eye. Surely, one could argue the result of their efforts was worthwhile. Cyberware improves the lives of countless people with its strength and utility, yet it also introduced a new age of whacked-out wealth distribution, ecological destruction, and the devaluation of human life itself. Naturally, the philosophical question ends up lying in asking yourself whether it is humanity's fault for relying on these technologies, or is it the scientists' fault for developing them in the first place? Who, ultimately, brings about the downfall? Both? Neither? The road to hell is paved with good intentions, after all. Dr. Frankenstein asks himself a similar question, and comes to a tragic conclusion. Toward the end of the story, Frankenstein makes a point of devoting his life to the destruction of the creature, knowing the threat his creation poses for a multitude of personal and existential reasons. He places the blame on his own shoulders and attempts to take action. What about the people living in a cyberpunk world? Given the chance to turn back and hunt down their very own creature before it could change the world, I imagine many would readily do so. In the cyberpunk anime Ghost in the Shell, a common theme is found in the contrast between the physical body and the less than physical mind. Some characters, particularly the Major, are even capable of transferring their minds from one mortal coil to the next, perhaps the ultimate expression of transhumanism, which is the belief that humanity should use technology to empower our bodies and minds. This power isn't without its drawbacks, however, as a cyborg body and digital mind are subject to attack from malevolent hackers. It's all part of the cost of living in a world bound to these rules of science fiction as established by Mary Shelley. Consider that life is also known to be transferable in Frankenstein. It is not some unknowable essence or enigmatic concept. It is quantifiable, capable of being captured and imbued. One only needs a vessel for it to inhabit. Elsewise, it is, usually, incapable of acting on our level of reality. This is an important concept to both Cyberpunk and Frankenstein. First, and clearly, there is a parallel to be found in how the body is treated as practically expendable. The young doctor's own priorities are easily interpreted. Frankenstein is more than willing to scavenge what he needs from the dead. Though he claims to only choose from the best of his available options, there is an obvious callousness so far as the bodies themselves are concerned. They're simply a means to an end. The person they once were is long dead and gone. The physical is trumped by the importance of the mental. That is why this concept of new life is so vital to Dr. Frankenstein. Not only is this an important theme, it is a large part of the genius which has granted Frankenstein such staying power in popular fiction. The archetype of the mad scientist, too involved in their own efforts to see the error of their ways, was born here. Once again, this theme is explored extensively in the game Cyberpunk 2077, with the story revolving around the main character V and the disillusion of their self as they are progressively replaced with the personality of a digital rocker boy, Johnny Silverhand. Throughout a playthrough, you are reminded multiple times that your body is nothing but a shell. The you that is you. That's the important bit. You only die when that part is dead, you're only alive when it is alive. Again, a connection can be drawn to Frankenstein, as the contrast between our physical and mental existence is another primary plot point. When the creature is first revived, he must learn to speak and write and live as a human by living adjacent to humans. In time, he develops thought and personality. While this example portrays more of a blank slate, waiting to be filled with personality, much like the cyborg bodies in Ghost in the Shell, there is an express importance placed on the fruition of a complex inner being, and its control over the self. Once the creature possesses an ego of his own, he grows to have wants and desires. The ego can only exist with experience, and experience can only be garnered through living. But the form that life takes is another matter entirely. The creature wants companionship. He wants acceptance. He wants to survive. The same is true of Cyberpunk 2077's V, who is struggling to maintain his ego during the entirety of the journey. Whether a biochip, a cyborg shell, or a brain placed in a stitched-together corpse, the body is shown to be of meager importance when it comes to matters of the mind. However, as metaphysical as the mind may be, it still generally requires a brain of some sort to exist. In essence, Dr. Frankenstein is a proto-transhumanist of sorts, willing to use technology to enhance the corporeal flesh. And while the context of the process and its results are profoundly different from many cyberpunk narratives, the idea of the story remains the same. Meat is just meat, a means for a person to get around. To many of the time, the concept may well have been sacrilegious, even terrifying. Thankfully, Mary Shelley was partial to a good fright. Another binding stitch which weaves its way through Cyberpunk 2077's narrative is that of ambition and its inevitable cost. Early in the game, fixer Dexter Deshawn lays bare the nature of this tale: quiet life or blaze of glory? It is a question which applies similarly well to the Edge Runner anime's protagonist David, who ascends the long ladder to becoming a legend of Night City. Still, committing to achieving this status isn't without its risk, and the majority of Cyberpunk's legends are long in the grave. The form of this ambition is not partial to any semblance of morality. Rather, it is the human condition itself which compels us to become stronger, to master ourselves and our environment, to feel recognized and remembered. The very same emotions propelled Dr. Frankenstein toward his fated experiment. The morbid act of gathering bodies, the long nights studying in the lab, the threat of filling a blank slate with violence, and the defiance of nature, each of these factors resulted in the creation of the creature. Whereas V and David gather body parts, spend long nights at the Ripper Dock, struggle with their ego, and the defiance of their natural state of being. The mirror might be a little dirty, but the reflection is certainly there. And how striking is that when comparing a classic horror novel to a dark concept of the near future? These innate drives form the crux of these stories. It is not a sense of malevolence or ill intent which birthed the creature. Rather, instead, it was a sense of pride. Pride which pushes us to prove our worth, culminates in the downfall of both Frankenstein and many of our examples found within the realm of cyberpunk. It is an undeniably powerful narrative tool, a universally recognizable feeling, an understandable feeling, no less. If you possess the genius of Frankenstein or the cyberware tolerance of David Martinez, would you be able to resist the temptation of power? Would you, too, end up appearing mad to your compatriots? Of course, the concept of being mad with power transcends genre, but when the results of this madness are achieved in the laboratory, as in Frankenstein and Cyberpunk alike, you are almost certainly talking science fiction. In conclusion, the bindings of science fiction as a genre draw the tale of Frankenstein and his monster quite closely to one of modern fiction's most enticing and beloved subgenres, cyberpunk. Themes of pride, hubris, exertion of our power over nature, and the separation between the physical and mental self run deeply between the two. One could argue the origins of these concepts, in a modern sense, first brewed within Mary Shelley's mind over 2 centuries ago, leading to brand new ideas of fiction and a new age of storytelling. After all, when Dex Deshawn asks you, quiet life or a blaze of glory, a dying Frankenstein replies that we ought to seek happiness and tranquility and avoid ambition.